good night's rest. Thank you that we can gather together this morning and open your word. As we do so, please be with us. Send your holy angels and your Holy Spirit that we may understand what you want to teach us today. Thank you, and we ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
I've got on the board the work that we've been doing for the last few days, but I just want to change subjects for a short bit, just to break things up. And there's actually three things I want to address. I don't think I'll be able to address one of them, but briefly, when we look at the visions, we've been looking at the visions, the Hazon, the Mareh, and the Marah vision. I presume, like me, most of you use PCs, not Macs, and you use Strong's Concordance on your, or you use Strong's, not Strong's, eSword. You use eSword on your laptop. So I don't think I've mentioned this as we went through the visions because we didn't go through all the verses. But if you go to Daniel 10 verse 16, this is just tidying something up. Someone recently asked me about, as you're turning there, you remember in an earlier class we mentioned in chapter 10 verse 1 where it talks about the thing. Anyway, we're there in 10:16. I'll address that thing in a minute while I'm talking. It says, "And behold, one like the similitude of the sons of men touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spake, and said unto him that stood before me, O my Lord, by the vision my sorrows are turned upon me, and I have retained no strength." On eSword, on your computer, and I'm working on version 10.40, and I think that's the latest one, the word vision there is, the coding for Strong is incorrect. So I don't know if you've noticed that before. I haven't mentioned it before. It's marked as 4758, which is the Mareh vision, but it should be the Marah vision. It's marked as the masculine, it should be the feminine.
Mine has the right one, and I use CD, Power CD.
Yes, yeah. So I'm just saying a lot of people use eSword. That's why I'm mentioning it, because I think most people everybody I know uses eSword. And on eSword, the coding is wrong in 10:16. And I can't recall in the classes that you've had previously, as School of Prophets, what the commentary was on verse 16. I think it was correct. I didn't pick up any issues. But I'm just letting you know, if you're using eSword, the coding's wrong. It should be 4759, which is the Marah vision, the feminine.
What have you used to correct eSword? What did we look for to find the true one? I mean, she said hers.
Yeah, I guess you're going to go with the weight of evidence.
Of other places.
Of other places, yeah. Yeah, several places. If you go on the phone, on your phone, and you use MySword, that's one of the popular Android versions. It's correct in there. Most online Bibles, Blue Letter Bible, Bible Hub, they're all correct. But I haven't checked an Apple, an OSI version. Sorry? Oh,
it's not an Apple thing.
No,
it's wrong on the iPhone.
Is it wrong on the iPhone as well?
It's just eSword thing, yeah.
Okay. Oh, because that's an eSword program that you're using. Okay. I didn't understand the question. I'm sorry.
I don't understand why you say it's an Apple thing, a Windows thing. It doesn't have anything to do.
No. All I said was, if you're using a PC, most people are using eSword. If you're using Android, most people use an app called MySword. It's one of the popular ones. And I said I didn't know what was popular for an Apple, on Apple system, what's popular. But I remember that eSword is available on the iPad and an iPhone, and I don't have access to them, so I don't know what they show on that. So you just need to keep an eye on that.
According to my program, there are 11 verses in the Bible that you find the word Marah, but some verses, I don't know if it's mentioned more than one, so.
Okay. And the other thing I wanted to quickly mention, while we're on this thing, the other thing we haven't mentioned is the reason why I was bringing this issue up, I said there was 3 points. The second point, which I don't think we're going to have time to go through, in 10 verse 1, Daniel 10 verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel. Now that word thing is dabar, which means something that's spoken. It's a pretty benign generic word. It's nothing special about the word itself. But I suggested that the way that word is being used in verse 1, it's referring to the Hazon vision. And I think you can demonstrate that if you go from Daniel 8 into 9, 10 and 11. You can build up a strong argument to show that that word debar, the way it's used, this is not a word study. Remember when we spoke about how William Miller does his proof texting? He's liberal with it. That's the way I expressed it. And people thought it was, like we talk about it sort of in a light-hearted way. But if you're dogmatic about how you're going to proof text, sometimes you can get to a dead end. So I think it's a valid use of proof texting when we say that the word debar, even though it has nothing to do with the Hazon, because they're totally separate words, can represent the Hazon vision when you see how that verse is used in relation to other verses, particularly in chapter 8 and chapter 9. So I was going to, someone asked that question because they'd seen something in class. So I was going to address that, but I'll probably do that another day. And the other thing that we haven't mentioned, just as we're talking about these visions, in Daniel 8:1, this is where we pick up the Hazon vision. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me. That word vision is the Hazon. And in its most basic sense, I've tried to define what those 3 visions are. The Hazon vision is the vision of prophetic history. It's when you see things that are occurring in history, whether it's nations warring against nations, these powers of Bible prophecy are coming to war and punish God's people, whether it's the story of Esther or the story of Ruth or the reform line of Christ. All of these are just the Hazon vision, their prophetic history that we bring in line upon line and understand at the end of the world. So there we picked up the Hazon vision, and we've spoken about the Mareh vision, which is the appearance of Christ, or it just means the appearance, and that's how God is going to respond to whatever the Hazon vision is in any particular context. And then you have the Marah vision, which is an experience that we go through. I've also mentioned that when you pick up the word Marah vision, which is the feminine form, the Marah, depending on what verse you're looking at in the Bible, it doesn't always relate directly to a response that you're having. So it's teaching us different things. It's not just teaching us that when you see Christ, that you prostrate yourself on the floor because your comeliness is turning to nothing. It has more truth to teach us than just that truth. And we haven't discussed that any further than that. I have mentioned that from Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, I think it is. I think it's verse 4. Up chapter 1 and up to verse 3 in Daniel, everything there is in the Hebrew. It's written in Hebrew. But in verse 4, it says, then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, which is the Chaldean language or Aramaic. As soon as it says that word, everything after that verse in Daniel is all written in Aramaic. It's not written in Hebrew. Up until you get to the very end of chapter 7. So from 2:4 all the way through to chapter 7, it's not written in Hebrew, it's written in Aramaic. And if you're not careful, you can get into problems when you word search, because you'll find very limited usage of those words. You have to dig a bit deeper to find what that word means if you want to do a word study on it. The reason why I mention that is because if you're going to do a study on the word vision in the book of Daniel, and you're looking at the Hazon, the first place you'll see it is Daniel chapter 8, I believe. Yeah, that's the point I'm making when you're going to do a study on it in Hebrew. But if you go back to chapter 7, verse 1, it says, in the 1st year of Belshazzar, if I'm going too fast, tell me. A lot of this is recap for most of us. In the first...
chapter 2.
Yes, I know. I'm just going back to 7 first.
Okay.
Because it's clearest in chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Without going into all the different words in here, that word vision there in Daniel 7 is not the same word vision that's in Daniel 8. And the reason for that is in a different language. And the word is Hazev. That's the best pronunciation I've got for it, Hazev. And the coding for Hazon is 2377. I'm going to flip the board hopefully, but I wanted to bring a point after we've addressed this issue. 2377 is the Hazon vision, and Hazev is 2376. This is Daniel 7, and this is Daniel 8. Is everybody following what I'm saying? Okay, we understand what we're doing. If you drop down and go and see where 2376 comes from, it comes from a Hebrew word, 2370, and then it goes to 2372. So 2372 is the root word that 23 Hazev comes from, and Hazev is an Aramaic word. That's Daniel 7 verse 1. But if you go to Hazon, which is 2377, and you see where that word comes from, this word comes from the word 2372. So what I'm saying is this. In Daniel 7, where it uses the word vision, its root word is the identical root word that you find in chapter 8 verse 1 when it talks about the Hazon. So simply put, the word vision in Daniel 7 is the same word that you find in Daniel 8, which is just another verification of what I suggested to you right at the beginning, that Daniel 2, 7, 8 and 11 are all the same vision. They're all the same vision, but they're dealing with the issues differently. The start dates and the end dates, actually not even the end dates, the start dates are different depending on which chapter you're going at, but they're all teaching the same story. They're teaching prophetic history, and they're all the same Hazon vision. So in Daniel 7 verse 2, and you pick this word up, 2376, and it occurs in a number of different chapters, but you can see it really clearly in Daniel 7 verse 1. If you go back in Daniel chapter 4 verse 5, Daniel chapter 4 verse 5. This is Nebuchadnezzar's second dream. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. So this is the vision that Nebuchadnezzar has, and he's going to be punished in this dream, a dream about this tree that he represents. And that word vision there is the Hazon vision. It's the same Aramaic word that you find in Daniel chapter 8. This is Daniel 4 verse 5. And
Did you notice that, but in this verse, the Hazon comes from another word, not 2372, it comes from 2370.
which word in?
Daniel 4 verse 5, the vision.
Let me go back to that. Maybe I missed something.
I don't know if you noticed that.
2370 comes from 2370.
Ah, yeah, okay, sorry. My
Oh,
fault.
did I miss
Yeah,
something? Oh,
yeah.
was it, I was still correct.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
still correct, yeah, sorry,
Okay.
my fault.
I think it's still 76.
It's 76, which comes from 2370.
Yeah.
And this is what Esau gives me as reference, but 2370 comes from 2370.
Yes,
So it's
yeah.
my-
Okay. And then you can pick up, there's other verses in chapter 4, but you go back to Daniel chapter 2, and I'm not going to pick up the first usage of the word, but I'm going to go to 28. 228. 228 says, but there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. The dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. So the visions that he's having, the vision of Daniel 2, is this Hazev vision, which is the Hazon vision. So just the word study will show you that 2, 7, 8, 11, and into 12, they're all the same vision. And we shouldn't get distracted that one's in Aramaic and one is in Hebrew.
What verse were you adding to?
I just read 2:28, but it's not the only verse that it picks it up in. I think it's 2. I think I've got 2:19 and 2:28. So 2 points I wanted to pick up. The Hazon vision is found in chapter 2, 4, 7, 8, and 10. And chapter 10 is referring to chapter 11. And chapter 11 and chapter 12 are the same vision. So every vision in the book of Daniel is the Hazon vision. You can show that through a word study. And the other thing we picked up in Daniel chapter 10, verse 16, if you use an e-sword, it's the wrong coding. So you just need to be aware of that. That's all I wanted to do on the visions at the moment. If we have time, I don't know if we're going to finish it. I just want to have a quick look at Daniel chapter 8, verse 11. In the book of Daniel, there are 5 verses that deal with the daily. We've already discussed this. This word daily, the tamid, occurs 104 times in the Bible. And when William Miller came across this word in the book of Daniel, he says it's the only place that he can see this word. When Ellen White addresses this word in the book of Daniel, she says the word sacrifice was supplied by man's wisdom. It shouldn't be there in the passage. So both these people are dealing with the same issue, but they're approaching it from a different perspective. And the way we explain it, the way I explain it, is to try and reconcile, to try and explain what both of those people, William Miller and Ellen White, are trying to explain to us by those short statements. Everywhere you find the word daily or tamid, it doesn't always come as the word daily. It could be continual. It has different English words, but the word tamid, every time you see it in the Bible, it's always going to be an adverb or an adjective, which basically modifies a noun or modifies a verb. It's only in the book of Daniel that you see it's used otherwise. There, it's neither an adverb or an adjective. It's a substantive or it's a noun. It says the daily, the definite article. And that's why William Miller, when he came to his studies, said that he couldn't find this word anywhere else in the Bible, and he can't find it the way it's used in the book of Daniel anywhere else, and he was correct in that. You can study that out, and that's true. And when Ellen White says the word sacrifice was supplied by man's wisdom, that's correct. When you take the word sacrifice out, you're forced to change that word daily into a noun instead of its usage if you put the word sacrifice into that, because I think it's an adjective the way it's used. So we've looked at Daniel 12:11, 11:31 and 8:12. We've looked at 3 uses of the word daily, but we haven't looked at 8:11.
In my Power Bible CD says that the word taken away, it's actually room. It's a doubling.
In which verse?
Daniel 8:11.
Daniel 8:11.
So taken away, it's actually room. Double of the room.
Have you seen any significance in that? Or
Perhaps you start into the topic first, so we can understand.
Okay.
It's easier for all of us if you just start into the topic first and then you go into.
before addressing
Sorry.
yeah, okay. So let's read Daniel 8:11. Brother Tabo, do you?
Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down.
So we're not going to cover all the intricacies of this verse because there's some things that we've already established, we already know. We know when we read from verses 9, 10, 11 and 12 that the subject that's being addressed here is brought to view in verse 9. In verse 9 it says, out of one of them came forth a little horn. That little horn in and of itself, the actual object itself is a feminine noun. A horn is a feminine item, so it has femininity to it, but as you go through the verses, there's something unique in Hebrew that we don't pick up in the English, that actions or verbs by someone doing something identifies gender. So in the English, if we were to say someone ran, the only way we identify the gender of the person who's running is by adding a pronoun into that sentence. So we'd either say he or she. So that's the only way you're going to be able to identify what that running is, who's doing that running, whether it's a masculine or feminine person. But in the Hebrew, it's slightly different because verb usage or action has gender attached to it. The actual word run, in a simple equivalent, would be slightly different words. They'd have an inflection on it, and there'd be a feminine run and a masculine run. So that's basically my simple overview of Hebrew. When you go from verses 9, 10, 11 and 12, it never mentions a little horn after verse 9. After that, you'll see when it's all the verses that are written from 10 to 12 never address the subject. In the King James, in the English, it's only brought to view as a pronoun. In the Hebrew, it's the same. There's no, the little horn is never brought to view again. But we want to understand, based upon testimony of 2, Daniel 2, chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, that when Rome is brought to view, you always see both phases of Rome. You can see both phases in Daniel 2 and both phases in Daniel 7. We're not going to go back and look at that. So we would expect to see the same in Daniel 8. But in Daniel 8, it only mentions a little horn as a singular item. We can identify this to be Rome, but you can't identify the two phases of Rome in Daniel 8. So then you have to dig a little bit deeper, and what you notice is that the verb usage from verses 9 to 12 oscillates from masculine to feminine, back again to masculine and feminine. And when you see that, it gives you the key that you need to have to unlock these 4 verses to understand which phase of Rome is being dealt with. So in Daniel chapter 8 verse 9, the usage or the actions of this feminine little horn is going to be masculine. Then in verse 10, it has a feminine action, verse 11 a masculine action, and then verse 12 a feminine action. And you can just about see it in the English. When the King James translators translated, even though they added an interpretation here, because they didn't put he and she, which they really should have done, they do give us enough information that even if you don't want to look at the Hebrew, you can see it in the English, because in verse 10, if you go to the last part of the verse, it says, and it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Actually, we can go right to the beginning of verse 10. It says, it waxed great, it cast down. It uses the word it, gender neutral. But verse 10, it says he. So it's gone from gender neutral in 11, then 11 it says he, masculine. Then in verse 12, if you've got the King James, you'll notice that it says him, but it's italicized. So that is an incorrect translation. And if you drop down to the back end of the verse, it says it cast down the truth and it practiced. So you can see this gender oscillation in the King James English translation. And this is the primary argument that we have, that the view of the daily that the church understands is incorrect. Because the church teaches in verse 11, this is the big discussion about the daily, this is where it always focuses on verse 11. The church teaches, by and large, that this daily sacrifice is Christ's ministration, and the person who's attacking this ministration is the papacy. And the papacy is a church, it's pagan, it's Rome in its feminine phase, in the context of these 4 verses. And we would argue or defend that it's not Rome in its feminine phase, it's Rome in its masculine phase, and it says it's he that's doing that. So that's the primary argument that we would have, to show that the way the church teaches this is incorrect. And there's many pioneer defences that we could bring into this. Ellen White makes commentary on this, but just from that you could see that going on. So before we look at we would look at Daniel 8:11. What I want us to see is that, I know this is there's a lot of information on there if you're new to what we're looking at, but if you go to Daniel 11 verse 14. So in Daniel 11 verse 14, this is just a recap of what we've been doing. We're not going to read the verses because we've read so many times already. 11 verse 14. Here you're going to see pagan Rome being introduced into history, into prophetic history. And they're identified by the term robbers of thy people. So these robbers of thy people in verse 14 are the identification that Rome is now coming into prophetic history. And we discussed the history of this, and we placed it right here in around 201 BC. 201 BC, verse 14, Daniel 11, Rome is coming on the scene and it's identified as the robbers of thy people. And that word robbers, again, isn't the most accurate translation. If you look at what the word robbers mean, it means someone who robs. But if you see someone who robs you is someone who breaks you. You know, they come and ransack your property or your possessions, and they basically bring you low. So the whole idea of these robbers of thy people is not so much someone who steals from you, but you can pick up this concept of thieving, but it's someone who breaks. So when Uriah Smith addresses this verse, he uses it in the phrase of the breakers of thy people, this nation that's going to come and crush God's people. And that's what Rome does. Rome comes to crush God's people in both its pagan and its papal phase. But when we get, we're going to skillfully jump over verse 15. When we get to verse 16 now brings us beginning around this history here about 168. From verse 14 to 16, it's just a continuum. There are a number of discrete battles that are going on, but we can pick up verse 16. There's an important battle that occurs, which is the Battle of Pydna. This is between Rome and Greece. This is Greece, Macedonia. There's an important battle in 168. And at that point there, and 168 is the date that most Seventh-day Adventist evangelists use as the transition date from Greece to Rome. So if you go to an evangelistic campaign and they put a chart on their screen, and they'll show you all these kingdoms and they'll put dates on them, 168 is invariably the date that they'll put on. And the reason they do that at one level correctly is because after this battle, Rome began to wipe out Greece. And so they use that as the beginning of pagan Rome coming on the scene of prophetic history. And when you understand verse 16 and all the truths that it's teaching us, this is when the transfer of the title from Greece to pagan Rome occurs, and that title of the King of the North. So the King of the North, the title, gets transferred from Greece to pagan Rome in verse 16. And that's why we've got KN here, King of the North, and I'm marking that at 168 is where the title is received for the King of the North from Greece to pagan Rome. And then we went through all of these verses. Verse 16 gives us a lot of history. And if you go from verse 16 to up to verse 28 really, from verse 16 to verse 28, there's a lot of repeat and enlarges going back and forth. That's why it's not that straightforward. It goes from verse 16, 23, back to 16, then 25 to 28, then to 24. And those of us who were in class, we laid it out here because we're seeing that you have four repeats. You have 14 to 22, then 23 to 29. It goes back into history. Then verse 30 covers this whole period. then verse 31 goes right back to this point and goes right up to verse 39. So you have these repeat and enlargements which aren't clearly seen if you just read things sequentially. The reason why we want to... Sorry, you go.
Don't you think that we should put the transition of the title of the King of the North more to that point when Rome conquered Syria? Because Macedonia, which was conquered in 168 in Pydna, he was not the King of the North actually.
Who wasn't?
Macedonia wasn't.
I guess how I'm understanding that is, even though we understand, you've got by the time Alexander the Great has died and he has his 4 generals take over, and then 2 of those generals get killed, and the whole empire gets split into 2, the Seleucid and the Ptolemies. You have the Ptolemies in Egypt, or the king of the south, and you have the Seleucid Empire in the north, where we get, Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes is of the Seleucid household. And more often than not, we see their power base as being in Syria, which is why Brother Marco's bringing this point. Let me rub some of this stuff off so that I can explain at least what his question is. Or it's not even a question, I guess the question stroke statement. Before I do that, let me explain the point I'm making, then I'll explain why he's objecting to the point, or he's making a comment on the point. I'm saying this, that from verses 16 here's verse 16, and I'm going to mark it here. I've got 168 right down to, I'm going to mark 28 here. 28. These are verses. We get to 31 BC from 168 BC. And we've got 2 other dates. I know there may be some disagreement on one of these dates, but I've got 63 and 64 BC. I think Uriah Smith has 65 here. This is the east. I'll put the glorious land, it says the pleasant land, and this is the south. What I'm doing here is I'm juggling 2 chapters at the same time. This is chapter 11, and this is chapter 8, verse 9. This is the language that's used in chapter 8, verse 9. The east, the glorious land, and the south. This is Syria. This is Israel, and this is Egypt. We mentioned briefly chapter 8 verses 9, 10, 11 and 12. Chapter 8 verse 9 is teaching us the transition from Greece to pagan Rome. When pagan Rome is going to come on the scene of Earth's history, before it can rise to supremacy, which occurs in 31 BC, it will rule for a time, or 360 years, until you get to the year 330 AD. And that history is being brought to view here. 31 BC to 330 AD, which is found in Daniel 11 verse 24. So, before it can rise and rule the world supremely for a time, it's going to take down these 3 territories. Syria, Israel and Egypt. And that's what's being addressed in chapter 8 verse 9. But this history is also being addressed from verses 16 to verse 28 in chapter 11. So you see these 2 chapters are dealing with the same histories. Most of this history here at this back end, from this point, this one and this one, are all found in verse 16. So we've got verse 16, 168, verse 16, 64 and verse 16, 63. But then you need to go to verses 24, 25 to 24 to 28. You need to go to these verses to pick up verse 31. That should be a recap. That's why I'm going quite fast and all of that. So that should be reasonably straightforward. What I'm suggesting is this, that the king of the north is here. And this is Macedonia. Is that how you spell Macedonia? Yeah? So this is Macedonia. And Brother Marco is asking, why are we not marking this as the king of the north? Does everybody understand what's going on? Often when we talk about the king of the north and the king of the south, we're going to be talking about the title of these two families who are controlling the Grecian Empire. It's the Seleucid Empire, or the Seleucid family, and the Ptolemies. This is in the north, and this is in the south. And his question is, why have I suddenly picked this as the switchover and not this as the switchover? Where normally we would think the Seleucid Empire is the king of the north. And part of his reasoning for saying that is when we come back to this history around here, 161, 158, we've got 158 marked here. 158 BC, verse 23, is the league between the Jews and the Romans. There's this league that's going on, and the person who's causing problem for the Jews is a Grecian king. It's a Grecian king, and his name is Antiochus Epiphanes. So most of Christendom teaches that Antiochus Epiphanes is the king of the north. You're all probably familiar with that. And I'm not saying he's Assyrian, but he's part of this household here, the Seleucid Empire, and he's based around Syria, and he's identified as the king of the north because these people are normally classified as the king of the north as opposed to Macedonia. The person who's been involved here is King Philip, I think his name is. So there's complexity about who's who. So his argument is, if we're going to be correct, then shouldn't this be the king of the north? So this is my reasoning why I think it's this. Let's maybe read verse 16. Sister Bromley, could you read verse 16 for us?
11 verse 16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed.
Okay. You read it in about 10 seconds, and as I was looking through my notes, because I've broken it all down into small pieces, I got even lost because I've got so many little bits of notes here. There's a lot in this verse. It says there's he, and there's him, and there's his. So there's lots of pieces to this verse. This is how I understand the verse. It says, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. I'm going to rub most of this off. I should have turned the board over because I don't need any of this. The only reason I wanted this was just to pick up this date here. If I just left that as it is and flipped the board over, would anybody have a problem? Could you remember that piece of information? Yeah. Could someone just give me a hand turning this board, because I don't want to drop. I don't want to erase some of this, but it looks too cluttered to pick up the point that I want to bring up. So there's lots of pronouns that are being dealt with in this verse. And let's see if we can break it down. It says, he comes against him. And then it doesn't say the he, but it's inferred because the way the verse is written. I'm going to put he here. He does what he wants. I think it says something like that. Yeah, he shall do according to his own will. He does what he wants, and no one stands up to oppose him. I just want to try and use the same King James words. It says him there. He does what... I'm going to change this because I want to keep the his. He does his own will. So I've kept the King James word the same, and then I've got him and he. And then it says, after that, he will come to the glorious land. Is that how everybody reads verse 16? Yeah? Okay, so it starts in the beginning of verse 16 says he. It starts with the pronoun he. So we have to identify who that person is before we can do anything with this verse. And I'm suggesting, I don't understand English that well, but I think this is the subject of this sentence. We'll call this a sentence. This is the subject of the sentence. And whoever the he is, he's going to do something. He is going to come against this person, and then he is going to do his own will, and no one's going to stand against him, and he's going to come into the glorious land. So just the way this is written, I'm saying this, and this are all the same person. Is that how everybody reads that? I think that's straightforward. And so this one here is the object, because the subject is doing something to the object. So we've got two people that are being dealt with here. That's all I want to say. And if this is the subject and you want to find out who the he is, you have to go back to the verses before that. So you have to go back to the verses that address who the he is. And I'm just going to go back one verse, verse 15. Brother Jonathan, can you read verse 15?
So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mound and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand.
So verse 15, this is 16. Verse 15, I'm saying the subject is the king of the north. It says it right in the verse. The king of the north is the subject, and the king of the north is going to do things. So as soon as we get to verse 16 and it says he, I'm saying that he there is the king of the north. So if I do it if this red works, I'm going to say this is the king of the north, this is the king of the north, the king of the north, and the king of the north. So all of these activities are being done by the king of the north. So on the board just before, without going into all the verses, we have 168, 31, 63, 64. These are all BC dates. And all of this is Daniel 8 verse 9. This is the east, the glorious land, and the south. And this is normally considered to be the king of the north. And I'm saying I'm suggesting this is the king of the north, and that as opposed to this one? Which one would it be? And verse 16 on the wording is the logic that I'm using. When it says he that come against him, we have to find out who this object is here. Who the object is, this him. And I'm just going to go back into history and identify what this struggle that's going on. And the struggle that's going on is between two people. There's, I'll call it Macedonia, and I'm going to call it Syria. And I'm briefly just going to put from the year 201, and if I put 158, okay, I'm not using these dates precisely, I'm just using them to cover a period of time. There's a war, there's a struggle that's going on between four groups of people, five, we'll go with the five. There's Egypt, there's Macedonia, there's Syria, there's Israel, and there's Rome. There's these five people that are all warring against each other, or with one another. Macedonia and Syria are together. Now, depending on what story you want to weave, you can show this. You can show that Antiochus Epiphanes, a Syrian, is making trouble with Israel. You can show that in that history.
Macedonia and Syria 201 to 158. That's not the war there with those two countries, right?
I'm saying this, that the story that I'm going to be talking about, which is at the beginning part of this verse and back into verse 14 and 15, covers a history. So 201 is where I picked up the robbers of thy people, and 158 is they shall have a league with the Jews. So I'm covering, I'm just saying in a broad sweep, there's many things that are going on here. And I'm just covering a few of those things. So for instance, the Macedonians and the Syrians, Antiochus Epiphanes is causing trouble with Israel. And because of this issue that they're having with the Greeks, Israel is going to go into a league with the Romans. So there's a relationship between this issue and this issue in this time period here. Plus, there's another history, another dynamic that's going on in this history where this group, where the Egyptians and the Macedonians and the Syrians, they're coming together, they've joined forces, and they're coming to make trouble with Egypt. So there's a relationship between these two struggling with each other. And then Rome is going to get involved in this, where Rome intervenes on behalf of Egypt. So all I'm saying is, in a simple way, I've got 168 here as a key event, but it covers a history. It covers a band of history that looks something obviously like this, 201 to 158. And in that story, Rome is going to rise. Rome is going to come on the scene of Earth's history. And when it does so, it's going to do two things. First of all, it's going to have interaction with God's people. We mark the date 158 when that occurs. But it's going to have an interaction now with Greece. Greece, just the territory of Greece, includes Macedonia and Syria. This is the king of the north, this whole territory that prophetically at least speaking, this is the territory that the king of the north owns, and this is the king of the south. So they're going to have some interaction with them, and I'm beginning that around 201. So when it says that he comes against him, I'm suggesting the him here is, if you want to take an individual specific battle, I'm marking it at 168. As an individual waymark, I'm going to mark that at 168 right here. But if you want to take it as just a band of history, you can go and talk all about all of this history here. but you end up at the same place. You can either take, when he comes against him, that this him is going to be covering all this history as Rome begins to take control of Greece, or you can do as we normally do, as I normally do. I prefer to mark them as specific dates, specific battles, and those specific battles, I'm not saying that's trying to limit what this verse is teaching, but it helps me to identify really precisely what that verse is saying and the history that it's dealing with. So we did that when we went, for instance, to Daniel 11 verse 31, where it says arms shall stand on his part, and it does three things for him. He shall take away the daily sacrifice. So the second part is to take away the daily. We could understand that as being, many battles, many events, many histories, but I want to mark it as a specific thing, which is the war in 508 between Clovis and the Visigoths, even though it might cover some progressive history. So this he coming against him covers a progressive history as it begins to take over from Greece. So this is the beginning of the rise of Rome, and this is when he's going to have it done completely. And the other day when we did this, I drew it something like this. I said this was Greece and this was pagan Rome. And then I said this was papal Rome. And we said that there's this transition period that comes on, and there's a transition period for the papacy as well. And this transition period is nothing more than this, 168 to 31. So it's marking the beginning of the rise, and once it's fully risen, that's what's being addressed. I'm saying this, that verse 15 is talking about the king of the north. Therefore, the he of verse 16 is also talking about the king of the north. The king of the north is the subject of this verse. And the first part of the verse says, the king of the north comes against him. And when I put history together with this verse, I'm saying the him is the history from 201 to 158, but specifically 168, because I think that was a prophetic waymark. And if that's the case, that this him used to be the king of the north, we know that used to be the king of the north, because in this history here, if you go back to this struggle here, the whole struggle of Rome is with these powers. It's with Macedonia and Syria. Antiochus Epiphanes is involved in all of this history. That this him, if you want to make it purely Syria, you have the ability to do that, because that's what's happening in this history when the league between the Jews and the Romans is happening. But I want to broaden Greece to just Syria. It's the whole of the Grecian Empire that the king of the north owns, and Greece is part of that. So that's why I'm marking 168. And so that him is this history. Therefore, therefore pagan Rome, and I'm identifying this as pagan Rome here, must have taken the title of the king of the north at the beginning of this transition period, not at the end. So that's my reasoning. Brother Michael.
In verse 15, it's saying that the king of the north is coming against the king of the south. And then in verse 16, it says, but he that cometh against, would it be correct to read, but he, pagan Rome, that cometh against the king of the north shall do according to his will? Because he who he's fighting against at that moment is the king of the north. He gets the title in that battle.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. If we don't have the ability to break down who the he's, all these pronouns are, we end up not being able to decipher any of these verses. So the second line of argument that I have, is if we go to Daniel 11 verse 40. When we address Rome on this message, we address Rome in three segments: pagan, papal, and we use the term often and not modern. And papal Rome is the papacy before the deadly wound, and modern Rome is the papacy after the deadly wound. If I'm correct in this reasoning, that pagan Rome is going to take 3 territories down, but before that it becomes the king of the north. So it becomes the king of the north, takes down 3 territories, then rules. If
I'm sorry, can I ask a really quick question? Syria, was Syria part of the Assyrian Empire?
no,
So it's a...
yeah. I think that we can, if we have 3 Romes, and one of the logics that we use for this is that this power had to take down 3 territories, the east, the glorious land, and the south. The papacy also had to take down 3, which are the Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. Daniel chapter 7, it takes down 3 territories, and then it's going to rule. We use this logic, the testimony of 2, to come to modern Rome, and we say that modern Rome is going to take down 3 territories, the king of the south, the glorious land, and Egypt. The king of the south, the glorious land, and Egypt, before it will rule. So we have license that to split Rome into 3 segments and not just have these 2 as one.
Can you repeat what the 3 territories that were taken down under paganism were?
Under paganism,
You got the 3 circled there?
Daniel 8:9.
Thank you.
Syria, glorious land, Egypt,
Yeah.
with a date.
Yeah, K in there. It's okay.
Okay, sorry, what have I done wrong?
On modern,
Yes,
K in is okay.
thank you. King of the south. Everybody's in agreement with that, that's all straightforward. If we're going to have Rome coming 3 times, we know sometime in history that the papacy took the title of the king of the north from the king of the from pagan Rome. The papacy got the title of the king of the north. It must have received that title from the king of the north, from pagan Rome, somewhere down the line. Okay, so I'm going to put here king of the north. I'm going to put here 168. That's what I'm suggesting, based upon that logic. So he must have received the title of King of the North. So we've got 2 options. Either we say the papacy has always been the King of the North, from whenever it got its title, all the way through history, or we say that when modern Rome comes on the scene of Earth's history, it gets the title of the King of the North sometime. So we've got 2 options, 2 ways of looking at that. Either it's always been the King of the North forever, or it gets this title twice. However we see that, I think it's twice. That's my opinion. When you go to verse 11, so let's read verse 40. Daniel 11, verse 40. Sister Sarah?
And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south, also the robbers of thy people.
Oh, sorry, verse 40.
Oh,
Sorry, I didn't say
sorry.
that correctly. I meant verse 40, not 14, sorry.
And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over.
So when we look at the second part of this verse, we know it's talking about the history in which we're living. It's talking about modern Rome. And my contention, my opinion is that modern Rome has already got the title of the King of the North before he begins to make war against the King of the South. He already has that title. He's already called the King of the North. And if you go back into, you don't even have to go back into the history of it, you know that he's already going to engage with the United States, with these chariot and horsemen, to come up with a battle plan to make war against the King of the South. But he's already got the title for the King of the North as he's doing this. So my point is that In modern Rome, he already has the title for the King of the North before he begins to take down 3 territories. He doesn't get the title either at the point or afterwards. Sorry?
He doesn't get the title for taking them down.
Yes.
He has the title.
He has the title already. So they're the 2 arguments that I have to show that the title for the King of the North is not when he takes down Syria here, but when he engages with the Macedonians and the Syrians back here. He has the title, and then he makes this push.
Makes sense to me. But I guess then we need to show why the King of the North from verse 6 in Daniel 11 at some point passes from Syria or from this Seleucid family to the Macedonian, but perhaps this goes too far now.
I'm not sure that it does. I'm not trying to say that it switches from them to them. I'm saying, brother, what are you saying, brother?
We don't necessarily have to say that, because we know that there were 4, and 3 of them merged into the Seleucid dynasty, didn't they? They all were under the control of the King of the North.
Yeah.
But when?
We know the dates of there was specific battles where one was engulfed by the other, and then the other was engulfed.
It
Syria
goes to beyond this.
Oh,
I mean,
it goes
the
beyond.
merging is even 31 BC. I think this is.
I think the 2 arguments are this. When you have the 4 generals, Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus, Cassander has the territory of Macedonia or Greece. Then when he comes off the scene, Lysimachus takes his territory. And when he comes off the scene, Seleucus takes his territory. And that's the reason that I've had, that it's not a transfer between Syria and Macedonia, that the Seleucid Empire covers all of that geography. Even though when you get to this date, you've got different kings running different countries. Prophetically, he owns all of that geography. And so I'm able to gloss over the intricacies that you want to bring up. So I'm not going to switch that you go from, that he gets a title from him. I'm saying all of this empire at one level is the same empire. And when pagan Rome is going to take over Greece, it's going to do it in 2 distinct stages. First, it's going to take down the King of the North, and then it's going to take down the King of the South. It's going to take these 2, the King of the North and the King of the South is Greece. So it does it in 2 phases, but the King of the North is a bit more complicated because you've got Macedonia and Syria, and it's going to do that in 2 phases, phase 1, phase 2. So King of the North, then the second part of the King of the North, and then the King of the South.
I'm just going to say he's engaged in warfare with the King of the North when he takes Macedonia. And so for me, I'm happy to call him the King of the North based upon that. You've literally got Syria and Egypt. Syria is north, Egypt is south. But Macedonia is part of Syria. So when he engages into warfare with Syria or Macedonia, which is part of Syria, he's King of the North.
So yeah, that's part of my argument. Plus, in this time period here, the League of the Jews is not so much to do with the Macedonians, although they are involved. It's more to do with Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a real member of the Seleucid Empire. But he hasn't subjugated this empire. This is the beginning. He takes the title, and then he's going to make good his title.
Do you have dates for your other transition times?
Which
Even
ones?
if you can't prove them? The papacy and modern Rome, when they're
he did them in the past.
Are we putting
Yes. So
508 or whatever?
So the reason why I've mentioned this is because this is part of the introduction into Daniel chapter 8 verse 11. So into Daniel chapter 8 verse 11. So maybe we'll make a start into 8:11. So that's where I'm leaving this, that it's 168 based upon Daniel 11 verse 40, the argument here that he's already got the title of the King of the North before he begins to take his 3 territories. And I think that's what's going to happen in verse 11 of chapter 8.
These other two, is that what you're saying?
The middle one.
I'm going to look at this one. I'm not going to say it's a proof because I'm saying on testimony of 2,
You know it's free.
it's going to get the title before it takes down the 3 territories, based upon these 2
Okay.
witnesses. This one you can prove through. They're both from just reading the verses as they read.
Okay.
He's already the king of the north. Then he takes down the 3 territories. He's already king of the north. Then he takes down these 3 territories.
Okay.
And I think we're going to see the same here.
Parminder, couldn't it just be from he gets the throne? From he gets the seat? He gets given the seat as king of the north?
Which verse? 8:11.
He's talking about paper Rome.
Papal Rome?
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
That's
that's
what I'm wondering.
yeah. So Revelation
13.
Yeah, that's the argument that I have. That's when that occurs.
That's where he's going. Right?
Yeah.
And he did that.
Yeah, I think I've already. So let's go to Daniel 8:11. We're not going to finish this. So when I look at Daniel 8:11, normally I'm going to look at 5 aspects to this verse. I'll list out the five things that I would normally deal with. The first one, did we read verse 11? Yeah, we read it already. It says, and he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by. So there's a word where it says by. So the first thing we'd see is that the word by is not correct and it should be from. Everybody in the church has that understanding that it shouldn't be by, it was translated incorrectly and it should be from. And in fact, the church uses that as the primary evidence, the punchline that they're going to show that it's Christ's ministry that's being addressed here. This is the argument that they're going to use, but when they say it's not by, but it's from. But we agree it's from. We don't have any issue with that. Then we're going to look at the word sacrifice. Then we'd look at the grammar of the verse. Then we'd look at the phrase take away. And then we'd look at the word sanctuary.
Not that it matters, but you still sacrifice.
Just put Mr. C.
Yeah.
Sacrifice. So by the time you address those 5 issues, and obviously before you've done all of that, you've already addressed the gender. You have a very, very strong argument to show that what we teach about the daily is that it's paganism, not Christ's ministration. We've already addressed the issue of the word sacrifice, that it's not there, it's been supplied. So we've addressed that issue. The sanctuary, you can show through a nice word study that this sanctuary cannot be it's simple. You've got 2 options with the sanctuary, and all I'm going to identify is the place. Either it's on earth or it's in heaven. You've got 2 options where this sanctuary is going to be, and you can show by this specific word sanctuary it's on earth. It cannot be a heavenly sanctuary. Now you'd spend a couple of hours going through these meticulously to show people what is what. This word from is a simple word study that you need to show, and you can't show that it's the word by. It's an incorrect translation. It should be from. Then you'd have to deal a bit with the grammar, and then you deal with the word take away. So the word take away, we've dealt with this in class a number of times. There are 2 words in the book of Daniel that are used, and it's not the only place that they're used. It's rum and sur. And rum means, they both mean to take away, so it's correctly translated as take away. And rum, I'm going to just mean that you're taking away something good, and sur means you're taking away something bad. And it's good and bad in your eyes. And in chapter 8, verse 11, it's this word here, not this one. So, first of all, it's an earthly sanctuary. Then, whatever this daily sacrifice that's been addressed, when it gets taken away, it's not thrown away or trashed or rubbished, which is what the church teaches is happening to Christ's ministry. It's actually something that's been, that's something good, that has value, that is intrinsically, that whoever's doing this taking away, that they actually, when they take it away, they actually want this thing. It has some intrinsic value to them. It's not something that's rubbish. And then we'd have to look at the grammar. So let's have a quick view of this verse. So I'm going to split this verse into 4 sections. I think 4 sections. So it begins by saying, he magnified himself even to the Prince of Hosts.
Maybe you should add also the sanctuary if it's not only the place in earth or heaven, but also if it's a pagan sanctuary, or if it is a godly sanctuary.
Okay, so as soon as you mention that, let me just quickly address that. Because I don't think the argument is, I don't think you can defend the argument that it's a pagan sanctuary or a holy sanctuary. I don't think you can defend that in this verse. Let me try and explain why. I'm just going to rub this out. So there are 2 words that are used for sanctuary. Let me do a little family tree. There's the word Mikdash and Kodesh. That's how I pronounce them. So if you go into the book of Daniel and you look at the word sanctuary, you'll see it's referring to 2 different Hebrew words. So we'll look at Mikdash and we'll look at Kodesh. Now, what you need to do is, you need to, we've explained how you do this. You go to Mikdash, you take the Hebrew coding, and then you've got various ways of doing this, but you go into your eSword computer and you go into, you can do it various ways. You go to KJV Plus, hit the search button, or you can right click it, either way, and you type in this coding and it will give every usage for this word here. So you need to be able to do that to confirm what I'm saying. So this word, I can't remember how many times it comes up, or this one, but it comes up. Sorry? 71's from Mikdash and Kodesh. You will find, if you do study, and what you need to do is not take my word for it, you really need to go and check this so you can stand on this truth. You're going to find that this is always an earthly sanctuary. Always. And what you're going to find for Kodesh, that it's always holy. So can you see the difference between the 2? This is always on earth. Every reference to this word when it's in its original form is Mikdash will always be dealing with a sanctuary that's on earth. And this is always going to be dealing with a sanctuary that's holy. Then when you get all those verses, those 70 plus verses, and you split them up, what you'll find is this, that sometimes it's dealing with a holy sanctuary, and sometimes it's going to be dealing with a pagan or an unholy sanctuary, depending on the verse. So you could go to the 70 uses, my sister just said, I think she says 71. You go to the 71 verses and you're going to find every one of those times it's always going to be dealing with a sanctuary that's on earth, But sometimes it's dealing with the holy and sometimes it's dealing with the pagan. So I'm just going to, for argument's sake, call that 36 and 35. Just as, so there's 36 verses where it says it's a holy sanctuary, and 35 are saying it's a pagan sanctuary, but they're always going to be here on earth. 382. So this one, what you're going to see is this. That this word here is always going to be dealing with a holy sanctuary, but sometimes it's on earth and sometimes it's in heaven. So I'm going to split that to, is it 191? I think it's 191. I'm going to say 50-50 split. So in all the verses that you're going to find that always 382 times is always holy. Half the time it's going to be a holy sanctuary on earth, and half the time it's going to be a holy sanctuary in heaven. And this one, 71 times, it's always on earth. Now when you come to Daniel 8:11, this sanctuary that's been identified here is Mikdash. It's this sanctuary here. So this is Daniel 8:11. So when you read this verse, you don't have proof in the verse that it's holy or pagan. You don't have any evidence in the verse itself from just a word study to show you what it is. But what you do have is proof that it has to be a sanctuary that's on earth. And if it's a sanctuary that's on earth, then if you were going to make this the papacy that's warring against Christ, the whole argument that the church has is that they're bringing down his high priestly ministry from the sanctuary in heaven. So they're using a heavenly sanctuary, and every time this is used, it's never dealing with a heavenly sanctuary. But you can't prove from the verse whether it's holy or pagan. You have to use another line of evidence to show that. So that's why I'm saying the sanctuary, it doesn't prove that it's holy or pagan. What it proves is that it has to be on earth, which is where we believe that it is.
But I remember Jeff always saying if Daniel really wanted to say that it is a holy sanctuary, then he could have used Kodesh.
He could have used Mikdash if he wanted to say it's holy.
Yep.
Yeah. No,
It's
but
used both ways in the
what
Bible.
he's saying is, you can't prove this from verse 11. I prove it by going all the way to verse 14, where you have two other references to sanctuary. Then you got a context.
Yeah, I'm not going to other verses, because when you go to verse 13 and 14, the word sanctuary, I think is in verse 13 as well. Yeah, it's not used in Mikdash, it's used in Kodesh. And there, I don't want to make the argument that it's something in heaven or something in earth. What I want to identify there, that it's a holy sanctuary, because depending on the history, then you'd want to draw in some truth there. So as an example, the argument that the church uses for verse 11, that the papacy is going to bring down Christ's high priestly ministry from the sanctuary in heaven, I think you can show from verse 13 and verse 14, particularly verse 13, because it says, how long is the daily in the transgression of desolation going to tread down the host in the sanctuary? So you know that pagan Rome treaded down the earthly holy sanctuary, and we know that the papacy has brought down Christ's high priestly ministry, but you can't show that from verse 11. Verse 11 is dealing with something that's totally different. So that's all I'm saying. From verse 11 on its own, our proof is that it's an earthly sanctuary. So it can't be dealing with the papacy. Oh, if we split this verse into these 4 bits, it says, pagan Rome, is going to magnify himself to Christ. And we can bring in Revelation chapter 12 into this, and we know that both at his birth and at his death, pagan Rome is doing this magnification, it's making war against Christ, and eventually at his death, they do magnify themselves above him and they put him on the cross and they kill him. So this is the first part of the verse, the magnification or self-exaltation of pagan Rome against Christ. And then it says, from him the daily is taken away. This is the most problematic part of the verse. Actually, there's only 3 sections. And then it says the place. Of his sanctuary is cast down. So what we need to be able to grapple with is who these pronouns are referring to, who the him and the his are referring to. Because it doesn't say pagan Rome, it says he. So he is the subject of this verse, and then it says from him and the place of his sanctuary. So we don't have time today to go into the intricacies of this, but it's in this argument or the discussion here about grammar that you can prove, and you really can show it, you can prove this, that the him, because you've got 2 choices, the him is either this person or this person. And the way the church would read this verse, it would say, he magnifies himself against Christ, and from Christ the daily is taken away, and the place of Christ's sanctuary is cast down. And it sounds really good when you do a surface reading of it, but you can show grammatically that that's not correct, and that this him is talking about pagan Rome. So the verse should read, pagan Rome magnifies himself against Christ, and not by, but from pagan Rome, the daily is taken away, and the place of his sanctuary is cast down. So,
my strong Hebrew says that the definition of the verb of room, it says to rise or rise in various applications, bring up, exalt. And even when they put away the take away, it's most like taking off or up. That's the application that they're doing it.
I understand all the intricacies of the word room and how it's used, and but I'm saying that it's the most basic level. If we try and steer away from the concept that it's taken away, I think we do a disservice to what the verse is teaching. At its most simple level, it's taken away. Now, when you take something away, you can take it away in different ways. And that's when you begin to see the nuances of what room really means. But it means to take away, it means you have 2 things that were joined together and you're going to separate them. And when you separate them, the process of that separation, room would teach you some uniqueness about it compared to sir. But it is a taking away. Is that what you're saying?
My thing is just to find that, it's taken away, but it's taking it up. I mean, like...
Yes. I agree that it's taken away.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I got it.
I have a hunch you're going to follow this up tomorrow.
Yeah.
I have a hunch you're going to do this, but I want to throw it in the mix because it's a minor point, but it's a major point. If you go to verse 11, and I don't know the grammar, and Parminder knows it way better than I, but in verse 11 it says, and by him or from him the daily was taken away. Grammatically, in order to define who him is that takes the daily away, the precedent, if that's the right word, is the prince of the host. Grammatically, you would read that it's by the prince of the host that the daily is taken away. You follow my thought process there? Okay, the church will use that argument to misrepresent who's taken away what. But what I want to point out is if you go into the Hebrew reads, at the beginning of the verse, it says, to the prince of the host he magnified himself, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. Are you going to deal with that tomorrow? Okay, all right. Never mind.
So, from him, from pagan Rome, the daily is taken away. And when it's taken away, oh, forget that. We're back here. The place of his sanctuary is cast down. So, this is 330 AD. And this is Revelation 13, verse 2. Revelation 13, verse 2 says that the dragon power of chapter 12, which is a representation of pagan Rome, gave to the beast of Revelation 13, which is representation of the papacy, three things. It gave, well, let's read the verse.
Power, seat, and authority.
Power, seat, and authority. And I wanted to just make one point here, which is in connection to something that we said earlier on, when we were dealing with chapter 11, verse 30. Revelation 13, verse 2, and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet was the feet of a bear, and his mouth is the mouth of a lion. And then it says, and the dragon gave him. Can we see the word him? It says it gave him. Let me read the verse carefully. Not him. I'm not looking at the word him. His. It said it gave him his power. And then it says gave him his seat. And the third thing it says is authority. But you'll notice that it doesn't say his authority. It just says authority. So, I understand this to be 496. 496, Clovis, pagan Rome. Clovis' pagan Rome is part of the pagan Roman Empire. He has something that's his. And what he has is military power. And he's going to give his military power over to the papacy. Then in 330 AD, which is going back almost 200 years, pagan Rome has a seat. It's his seat, and he's going to give his seat over to the papacy. But in 533, pagan Rome, this is the Eastern Roman Empire now, Justinian, is going to give ecclesiastical authority to the papacy. But Justinian doesn't have ecclesiastical authority to give to him in the first place. He doesn't own it. And so the verse is pointing this out when he says he gives him authority, but he doesn't give him his authority. So there's a distinction between these two and this authority. And it's not germane to what we're dealing with now, but I didn't bring this point out when we were dealing with verse 30 about this whole argument about what's happening in 533. What's being given to him. Pagan Rome doesn't have any authority. He has no right to give to the papacy something which he doesn't even own. So I'm marking the place of his sanctuary being cast down is 330 AD, which is the seat. And hopefully what I want to try and show tomorrow, we'll see if as we discuss it, if this is correct, that what's taken from him, this daily, is also occurring in 330 AD.
It's not the Pantheon?
What are you referring to, sorry?
The sanctuary.
This one here, the place of his sanctuary, yeah. What I normally mark is not the Pantheon. I know the Pantheon is there, but I try and address this issue, it's the place. Because the verse says the place, we could take that out, it says the place is cast down. The place is cast down, that's the thing that's being cast down. I don't think it's so much the sanctuary that's being cast down. Rome. The place is Rome, the city of Rome. Which is the seat of his power. And the reason we mark it as 330 AD is because, just coming back to this story here, these are the dates that we got from Daniel 8 verse 9. And if we were to run this through into the future, which is 1124, this is that time, 360 years, that Rome ruled supremely from the city of Rome until you get to the date AD 330. In 330, Constantine, after having made a Sunday law, absconds, because he knows he's in trouble, to a different place. And then innocently the Pope comes and takes his seat and takes the wrath that was due to Constantine. Constantine was supposed to take this wrath.
A seat is a throne, is a kingdom.
Yes.
Becomes the king of the north.
He becomes the king of the north, and that's what I think's been identified there in verse 11. We're already run out of time. We'll carry this on tomorrow. I've given you the breakdown, but we'll go and really hammer out the proofs of this so that we're sure on it. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your loving kindness and your goodness towards us. We ask and pray that you would be with us, that Lord, you would help us to not only to be diligent students, Lord, but as we read your word, to fall in love with you, to have a desire to meet you in your word. Father, even in what some people would consider to be a dry repetition of historical battles, Lord, we don't believe these verses are teaching us that. We believe that these are teaching us a revelation of who and what you are. And as we see the beauty of your holiness, Lord, we know that these words have power to change our lives. Father, our prayer is today that we would meditate upon these things and that we would be drawn closer into a relationship with you, Lord, that cannot be broken. Be with us and bless us now, we pray and ask in the name of Jesus. Amen.